Of the diplomatic missions, distinguished academics, Organes, bienvenida, bienvenido, welcome. It's my pleasure as head of the resident coordinator's office to welcome you to our advocacy hall in Yıldızkulu. This is also the meeting room of the United Nations. That's where all important things in the UN in Turkey are discussed. But let me also convey warm regards and greetings from Mr. Alvaro Rodriguez, the resident coordinator. He regrets not to be able to participate because he's abroad due for other commitments. As you might know, this is also the week of the resident coordinators retreat, where all the RCs of the world are meeting. This year it's happening virtually, but he's doing it from Canada. So he sent his regards as well. So as you know, the UN is committed to advance the SDGs and Agenda 2030 in line with the principle of leaving no one behind. We do that in partnership with member states, governments, private sector, academia, civil society, and other international organizations. The UN in Turkey is also highly committed to protecting people, to securing prosperity, safeguarding the planet, even more and more important, and maintaining and fostering peace and enhancing partnership for sustainable development. The concept of sustaining peace and the SDGs are complementary and mutually reinforcing. So while sustainable development on the one hand underpins sustainable peace, more peaceful and inclusive societies, on the other hand, create an environment conducive for sustainable development. In this sense, Sustainable Development Goal 16 has a unique focus on promoting peace, justice, and strong institutions to support achieving a development which is inclusive, sustainable, participatory, and human-centered. So therefore, today's workshop on achieving sustainable peace and protection under the Agenda 2030 is timely and important. And I wish you a fruitful discussion at today's workshop, and let's hope we're going to have some tangible results and recommendations at the end. Now let me please introduce the panel of the workshop. First we have His Excellency Gustavo Campos, who is the Ambassador of the Republic of Costa Rica. He is also the host of the workshop and will moderate the panel. Then we have His Excellency Mr. David Fernandez Poyana, who is a permanent observer of the United Nations University for Peace to the UN in Geneva and to the other international organizations in Geneva. Then we have His Excellency Ramon Blecua, who is from Spain, and Ambassador on Special Mission for Mediation and Intercultural Dialogue. And last but not least, Associate Professor Dr. Pinar Erchan, who is the chair of the branch of Public International Law at the Department of International Relations and also the director of the Tour to Peace for Sustainable Peace Research Group at Hacettepe University in Turkey. So, Mr. Moderator, Your Excellency, over to you.
Thank you very much. My gratitude for the UNDP here in Ankara for help us to organize this meeting and welcome excellencies, academics and friends. Thank you all for coming. This is the continue of our meeting in 2019 in the Hacettepe University, in which with the collaboration with this panel, we started the discussion about the interrelations between the right to peace and the responsibility to protect the path toward peace, justice, and a strong institution. At that time, we have not only academic panel, but also we have a discussion and a round table with the United Nations agencies here in Ankara. And at the end, we collect all the experiences and positions for different actors in order to continue the study of the SDG number 16 as a synthesis of these two international instruments. Today, I have the honor to chair this panel with this distinguished not only diplomats but also academicians, and we will present at the end from the University of Hacettepe the conclusions of the panel that we had in December 12, 2019. To give just a glance for these introductions, all we know that the present and the future actions in the multilateral system have evolved and have been also under the pressure of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. Even though there has been progress in many areas in the international agenda in the recent years, the violence displaced people has increased conflict with cultural power competitions, regional struggles for hegemony, proliferation and non-state actors, proliferation and armed conflicts are still on happening in this world. International multilateral order changes, but the question is if that changes have threat the multilateral system. The multilateral system connected with some other issues like climate change or environmental degradation and economic and social inequalities also have been affecting the agenda for peace. And it is important to review this peace agenda, how can be improved, and how the societies and the states can use education, for instance, and social support in order to find the way to face this new elements or the strength of the past elements. In the case of Costa Rica made its own sustainability voluntary national review, and it was very important for me to mention that the Costa Rica institution assessed that and examined 212 recommendations during the 2019. And the government of Costa Rica decided to communicate this declaration, voluntary national review, to the UPR working group that the country made decisions and accept 194. And it's important to mention here that the recommendations were analyzed in order to link them to different SDGs and to determine the amount or percentage of recommendation related to each of SDGs. And it's important to notice that the SDG with the largest number of linked recommendations were first the SDG number 16. That's why I call us the attention that it's important to keep an eye on this recommendation, which concerned 65.5% of the attendance of these recommendations. Also, it's important to mention that according with United Nations report, the SDG 9 in the public finance support is the SDG number 16, is the number 9 in the public finance support, and 9.36 in the percentage of distribution activities executed by United Nations by SDGs. So these figures represent that the SDG number 16 is in the top of the concern of our societies and governments, but at the same time needs more support, not only for the states, but also societies and the international community and international organization, of course. So in Costa Rica, we are monitoring different situations with legislation, political control, budget approval, representation and citizen participation, internal institution coordination, and administrative actions. And we started with 3 stages, implementation stages, which concern the 2030 agenda. We also want to share this floor, first of all, to analyze our situation in from different perspectives. And I will give the floor for our next guest, which is His Excellency Ramon Blecua. He was introduced already, and he is an expert in mediation. And it is important to have reference on the mediation as certainly in process in this transformation in United Nations. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I think what my dear colleague Gustavo has just presented is basically the blueprint for this new multilateral agenda that we have all been working and which the government of Spain has committed as a new reinforced multilateralism based on the Agenda 2030 and based on the Sustainable Development Goals. But at the same time, we have to take into account the dramatic call that the Secretary General has made in front of the General Assembly last 10th of September, when Antonio Guterres has basically made an urgent call for action to the international community to address the challenges of this triple systemic crisis that the ambassador just mentioned, of climate change, environmental degradation, growing inequalities, growing social and economic inequalities, and the proliferation of conflict and big power competition. And in the words of the Secretary General, the international community is failing. So the multilateral system is actually facing probably one of the most dramatic challenges that it has in years. The years of the 6 years since 2015, when the international community agreed on this common agenda and based on the Sustainable Development Goals, seems to be far, far behind. The Sustainable Development Goals remain the signposts or the roadmap for this new partnership between large powers, small countries, civil society, and new international actors. What has happened is that basically this common agenda has been facing a different reality that is being shaped not by the principles of the UN, but by the new power struggles defined by the new technological order, by the inequality in the control of artificial intelligence and big data processing or management, in the control of the data themselves, in the transformations that this is actually bringing to the economic system and to the power or in the struggle between different nations. We have all seen that the new wars are not being fought with conventional armies, but in the cyberspace, with different instruments, with autonomous weapon systems, with disinformation, with fake news, with the manipulation of public opinion, and with many other tools that are unregulated, because the new technological order is completely unregulated. Nobody is in control. Non-state actors are now the real players. Most of the conflicts in the region actually have been, or the outcome of these conflicts in the region has been defined by non-state actors, be it militias, be it digital platforms, be it transnational criminal organizations, be it big corporations. The privatization of security, military services, and technological surveillance does not bode well for let's not talk about the multilateral system, we're even talking about the traditional state system. So the players are changing. And we're still trying to keep the door of the stable locked when the horse already bolted. Conflicts are evolving. The report of the DPPA for strategic planning for 2020 to 2022 describes very clearly that conflicts are now larger, longer, wider, more complex, and more difficult to address with traditional mechanisms. So we have this sort of clash of narratives that has defined the 21st century. Because when we start in 1999, the clash of civilizations and the war on terror that is triggered after the terrorist attacks in New York in 2001, that obviously comes with a kind of metaphysical vision of the fight of good against evil, like an endless war in which no semblance of agreement is possible. As Dick Cheney said famously once, when the Iranians tried to negotiate in 2003 a grand bargain to resolve the bilateral questions, he sent back the answer, "We don't negotiate with evil." On the other hand, in 2005, the Alliance of Civilizations is adopted by the UN. Secretary General Kofi Annan basically takes this initiative presented by Turkey and Spain as one of the programs that will build a new security architecture based on culture as a bridge for understanding and coexistence, not as a weapon that can be used against those who don't think like us. Let's say, in a way, Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are a continuation of that trend. They are also a part of this narrative that believes that it's possible to create new partnerships and that big power competition is not an unavoidable fate. So we have these two different narratives that have been in conflict, and this is within the international community. But when we go down to the concrete conflicts, to the regional scene, and let's face it, 80% of the conflicts are taking place in the Middle East and the Arab Islamic world. So conflicts have changed tremendously. Now we have these sort of ethno-cultural, sectarian components that make conflicts much more intractable and difficult to address with traditional political tools. It's gone the time in which we could sit different countries and maybe rebel movements around the table and find a regional agreement and sign documents that eventually may be the basis for a different kind of political settlement. These days, we don't speak to half of those actors in conflict. And the recent fashion of sanctions basically is leaving us with no interlocutors to talk to. Because everybody we don't like, we first sanction, then we put them in a list of terrorists, and then there's obviously not much to talk about. Because basically we define our incapacity to address dialogue. I mean, as Rabin famously said, when the Palestinian-Israeli peace process was being put in motion, he said, "We don't make peace with our friends. We make peace with our enemies, and we need to talk to our enemies." So we seem to be only wanted to make peace to our friends these days, and they are becoming less and less. So these new type of conflicts, as I mentioned, in which new technologies are becoming the main instrument of confrontation, instruments that we don't control, that we don't have, that when those who want to create or fan the flames of conflict have many more resources and technological instruments at their disposal than the mediators or the peacemakers, demand a change in the conflict resolution toolbox. The European Union is doing precisely that. The new concept note adopted 7th of December 2020 defines a completely new holistic approach in which peace building is not based on the traditional political or ideological conflicts, but on the issues that have to do with environmental peace building, with conflict resolution as a tool for conflict prevention, with the role of women in the peace and security agenda, with the role that new technologies have, with all the climate change related conflict drivers, with interreligious dialogue. Many of those things were there before, but the problem is that they were not made operational. They were just part of a theoretical debate. The only way that mediation can actually now change this situation is by basically adopting a completely hybrid approach, including the emotional aspects of conflict, including the cultural specific context. Because it's very interesting. I said 80% of the conflicts come from this region, but 95% of the mediators come from the West. So it's not because in the region there's not traditional ways of conflict resolution or because there's no capacity. It's because the narrative is being, again, defined from outside and based on principles that do not necessarily relate. I mean, when we talk about transitional justice, that's a very favorite subject in the UN lingo. In a conflict in Iraq, and I served as ambassador of the European Union to Iraq, I mean, that's a recipe for disaster. Because you do a commission like in South Africa, in Iraq, and the families and the tribes will have to kill each other in the outside of the room. While they use a traditional approach that is using the blood money or the tribal mechanisms, they reach agreements that are actually sustainable or enforceable. So I think we need to change the tune. And we need to learn that the world is not anymore based on our worldview, no matter how nice that may be. But I think the case of Afghanistan has been a tragic reminder of how our dreams of political or social engineering based on superior military and economic hegemony does not necessarily work. 20 years later, the US have actually made a deal with the Taliban, whom they declare a terrorist group that will be utterly destroyed and will never come back. So there is a lot of very unpleasant realities in the world of mediation, conflict resolution. You have to talk to people you don't like, and you have to accept that your principles do not necessarily prevail. But unless we do that, we'll not be able to make a difference. We can keep talking and feeling good about what we say, but we'll make no difference. So I think now the process of reflection that the Secretary General has opened for our common agenda and for a new security architecture, a new peace agenda, will be a very important period for all of us to reflect and to incorporate lessons learned. In 2023, there's supposed to be, again, a multilateral summit in which conclusions will be adopted. And there's certainly a lot of work to do. So I think initiatives like this are a useful venue to basically start discussing and taking other points of view. So thank you for the invitation and for the initiative. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, so I will end here. I've already spoken too long.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very interesting, and that give me the support to in this hybrid approach that you mentioned. That we will see later, and the contribution and from the HTTP University and Professor Pinar as academically developing about how to take the advantage of SDGs to create more comprehensive solutions for this kind of problems. But our ambassador David Fernandez will mention not only the sustainable peace and the resolutions about this, but also how is the COVID-19 pandemic has affected the states of peace interstates and societies. In particular, the increase the hate of speech and in that context, initiatives that such as ours or the Alliance of Civilizations that was mentioned help to mitigate these effects. Thank you, Ambassador, for coming today, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Deeply, first of all, the organizers of the event, the Kingdom of Spain, the Republic of Costa Rica, the good friend Pinar, Hacettepe University, for convening this event, and also, of course, the United Nations office in Turkey. This is really my first public meeting. I talk in a big gathering. I'm very happy, and then for being with so many people. This is the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this sense, I would like then to refer how it's affecting the Sustainable Development Goals and in connection with the pandemic. I think this meeting it's timely because we are now living in a very difficult times in which international community agree in 2020 to develop and to implement specific targets, measures of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this show that the difficulties that we are living today for the COVID-19. But I mean, in the 20th century, there have been three main pandemics in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 80s. But what is the difference? What is the impact? What is that value of this pandemic? It's affecting one of the main principles of the international community, the principle of globalization. This is the first time that the markets, the people are affected in general terms by the pandemic. In this sense, we present as a University for Peace, we cooperate with the Secretariat of the Group of 20, the G20, in particular with the presidency of Saudi Arabia, and we present a report about in 2020 in Riyadh about how was affecting the pandemic to the promotion and protection of all human rights for all. And one of the conclusions that we raised and was very well received by member states of the G20 was the worrisome increase of the Islamophobia in the world, the racism, the anti-Semitism. This is one of the most relevant outcomes and effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I said before, 2020 was an important year. The international community, United Nations, agree that this year was then to implement specific targets and coincide dramatically with the COVID-19. For this reason, all the aspirations, all the agreements that the international community agree and or Ambassador explained before, in the Sustainable Development Goals are, let's see how they are going to be, implemented. The Secretary General of the United Nations already recalled in the General Assembly that the best way to defeat this crisis is through multilateralism and solidarity. And when we see the response of the international community, for instance, with the issue of the vaccines, even within our community, the European Union, or even in the some poor countries, they don't get access to the vaccines, and we can then think about the solidarity. One of the main principles of the international community, and one of the main principles of the chapter of the United Nations is the cooperation among all member states. And then we have in the future some, I think, three main challenges regarding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one is the issue of the future of the work. As you know, one of the oldest specialized organizations of the United Nations system, the International Labour Organization based in Geneva, created after the First World War in 1919. It's very interesting to recall the linkage between the social peace and the work. We cannot have peace if we don't have work. And we are, looking how specific segments of the society are affected for the lack of work. And in particular, it's affecting to the women and the access of women to the work. And the dramatic increase of the violence against women and girls in all the societies. And no society is escaping to this trend. Another issue, an important consequence or challenges, I don't know what to say, the post-COVID pandemic. Maybe we are now in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Who knows? No, what is post, after, before? But it's the issue of the food security. And in accordance with the different reports of the United Nations, 500 million of people are going to go to the poverty. And it's, maybe you remember, you have read on this issue, the crisis, and the consequences of the crisis, of the financial crisis in 2008. What happened here in this part of the world? I mean, the Arab Spring. This is one of the causes of this turmoil in the region because of the food security. In this sense, the work made by FAO, the World Food Program, it's really an important mandate that they have then to deal with this issue. And the third point that another of the challenges is the right to education. We have seen, the lockdown of the schools, the lockdown of, member states. They were, United Nations was clear. Member states were applying the emergency powers in accordance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And one of the big issues was the access to education. When now we have said that there is an increase of hate speech, and I think education is vital. It's vital then to promote the reconciliation, vital then to avoid this increase of the attitudes of the hate speech. For that reason, I think initiative like that that we organize here today, for the first time, as I say, in after the COVID or during the COVID, or initiative like promoted by and led by the Kingdom of Spain, together with Turkey on the Alliance of Civilizations, all the initiative led by the World Muslim League, the World Youth Congress, and the Vatican, supported and led by the University for Peace, in cooperation with many other governments, in particular with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Costa Rica, I think they are very important. Because the only way to overcome our difference is through education. In this sense, the mandate of UNESCO, it's, as you know, the chapter of UNESCO, what is Ambassador of Mexico, she knows better than me. Argentina, sorry, Argentina. You were based in UNESCO, and you know perfectly the mandate is the education. It's the key for superating and overcoming all the difference. For that reason, I don't want to spend more time of my presentation, and I thank you again, and I appreciate the invitation by Costa Rica and the moderation, the sound moderation of Ambassador Ramon Blecua, Professor, and thank you all of you, United Nations, Turkey. Thank you for attending this meeting.
Thank you, Ambassador David Fernandez, for your comments and to share your experience. And we will continue with our program with Dr. Pinar with the University of Hacettepe University. And we have a meeting that 2 years ago. Our second meeting was postponed by the COVID, and now we have the chance to get together again and analyze the conclusions that we have the first meeting and all the appreciation of the, let's say, point of view of all the actors we had at that meeting that we have in your university. We really appreciate that openness of your university to receive us. And tell us what was the analysis of the SDG 16 as let's say, that create a new comprehension of the different instruments like a right to peace, or R2P, or many others institutional initiatives that can help us to go, as Ambassador Becqua said, this need a new understanding that is necessary to face up today. Thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like to first thank UNDP for allowing us to be here and hosting this meeting, and it's a great honor to be in the advocacy hall, which means a lot also in terms of the importance of the place. And also I would like to thank the Embassy of Costa Rica and Embassy of Spain for organizing this event, and I would like to thank Ambassador Fernandez Buena and Ambassador Ramon Buriaca for being here with us today. As Mr. Ambassador has said, it has been 2 years, actually 2 years and 5 days since we have held the first meeting. When we started this project with great hopes, we were hoping to make a change. We will see if we will have even a small impact, because from an academic's point of view, we always talk about politics, we write on politics, we research on politics, we say big things, but we see no action, which turns out to be quite annoying. So this is one of the points where, in the case of the two R2Ps, the right to peace and the responsibility to protect, or at large SDG 16 or the SDGs as a whole, individuals matter and individuals' contributions matter. And taking this chance, I also would like to thank my research group, composed of brilliant women, brilliant graduate students, 4 of whom are here today, again assisting us in terms of reporting the meeting. So I would also like them, because, as I said, although we are small in number, we are individuals. When we act together, when we act in solidarity, it will make a change. Maybe in the long term, but it will. So we had prepared a statement that was based on the conclusions of the first meeting, where we had wonderful contributions of UN representatives, and we had a very long discussion in our closed meeting. So I will briefly present it, and we hope that from here we hope that we will move on with a political action, and we would like to see states acting on their words, turning words into deeds, because in UN meetings there have been made many promises at different platforms. There have been clashing points of view, some states supporting the right to peace, some others supporting R2P, vice versa. But we need action, and we need it soon, as COVID pandemic has shown us. We need solidarity more than ever. So our title was Achieving Sustainable Peace and Protection under the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, and we argue that on the basis of the 3 pillars of the United Nations, that is the very basis of the idea, where peace and security, human rights and development underlie for a peaceful future for the humankind and the planet. These pillars have inspired development, progressive recognition of the rights of humanity, and initiatives for tackling the challenges that threaten international peace and security. The complementary aspects of the 3 pillars and their vitality are reflected in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and in its 17 goals. In 2015, when the UN member states adopted the agenda, the underlying idea was a more comprehensive approach, the main difference between the SDGs and the MDGs was the inclusion of new items, such as peace, because we know that there can be no peace without development and no development without peace. So this inclusive agenda also introduced SDG 16, that is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And it has been a result of this realization. The Charter of the United Nations implies that peace is more than the absence of war. The world has changed. We are not talking about the post-Second World War world any longer. So we cannot see it as merely as the absence of war. And thus, the Charter envisions the application of outstanding legal provisions of international human rights law by the international community as a whole, which should be aimed at progressively eliminating those issues likely to cause war as well as human rights violations. An analysis of international human rights instruments confirms the conviction that respect for human rights, including the right to development and right to education, are at the core of peace. The 2030 Agenda and the concept of sustaining peace, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 2282 and General Assembly Resolutions 70/262, are complementary and mutually reinforcing. While sustainable development underpins sustainable peace, more peaceful and inclusive societies create an environment conducive to sustainable development. Hence, sustainable peace turns out to be both an enabler and an outcome of sustainable development. In that regard, ensuring peace and protection is much more preferable than having to seek a cure to an acute crisis, which we do generally. We save the day, we try to find solutions to imminent threats or actions. So this is too late. This is why we need to take a preventive action. And therefore, we have to seek sustainable prevention, and we need to develop a sustainable prevention strategy, placing the notion of peace at its core so that we can seek for sustainable peace. And then we can sustainably contribute to sustainable development. This requires the internalization of a culture of peace, which is a set of values, attitudes, traditions, and modes of behavior and ways of life as identified in the Declaration of the Culture of Peace. This is one of the documents that we have to hold on to and we put into practice. The promotion and the further development of a culture of peace is necessary for the development of a sustainable peace environment, mutual respect, and international cooperation. In this regard, governments, civil society, and media, as well as individuals, are essential actors for the development of a human rights education for the promotion of a culture of peace. Acknowledging that peace is a positive, dynamic, and participatory process, where conflicts and human rights violations can best be prevented through dialogue and cooperation without politicizing issues, all stakeholders have to act in solidarity and promote tolerance, mutual cooperation, and intercultural dialogue. This is one of the things that we are missing. We hold on to our differences instead of trying to overcome these differences and turning them into constructive dialogue. So this is one of the reasons, as in the example of the two R2Ps, right to peace and the responsibility to protect, we have to have participatory processes, including all nations of the world. This is how we can overcome our differences. As Ambassador Puyana has said, education is at the core of overcoming these differences and overcoming intolerance in terms of fighting with intolerance. And as Ambassador Bluica was saying, players are changing. His examples were kind of negative examples, which kind of increase more challenges in terms of tackling issues. But individuals, on the positive side, individuals, thanks to current technology, individuals are becoming more and more influential. So in that regard, looking at the positive side, we have to include individuals more. And in that regard, we have to make individuals be more tolerant and open to diversity and promote intercultural dialogue. This is the way only through constructive dialogue and discussions that we can improve and we can have a more inclusive world. Not some deciding for others, but deciding together. So as concluding remarks, what we say is that as we have come to a common conclusion that this is a time that we need collaboration, cooperation, and communication in an ever-increasing manner. Being a part of this constructive process is highly important for unheard voices to be heard and for diversity to be the basis of international consensus. Being critical or wanting change is not enough. State members should be a part of the change, voice their concerns in a constructive manner, play their part, and lead development. This requires active participation, representativeness, open diplomacy, and multilateralism. Those member states which pioneer such processes shall have their place in the history and will be remembered in a positive manner. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to a very constructive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. And now, well, thank you very much for this innovative perspective. And we will make a break to analyze all this dialogue, have a coffee, and return to an open panel that you can express your questions or clarifications in order to feed this process, because this is a process that we analyze in academically with those two universities here, in a way that our perspective as a country is to give a little tiny help on this whole situation. Thank you. We want to make a little break and then we will continue. Thank you. Don't change the channel, please. Stay tuned. I would like, before to start this segment, to present my gratitude to the reporter from the University of Hacettepe. This is very important for this next stage is very important for us because the dialogue that we can encourage here will be used in the notes the reporters will collect, and then also to keep the academic studies, and also to assess the progression and or which other areas we need to cover. We will at this segment. You are free to make your questions or remarks. If you want to make remarks, it's not necessarily only questions. And we will stay here as much as time permits for everyone, but we don't want to spend more than the time that generally we receive from on PD today. I would like to, we will start to make questions between us to encourage you to make more questions. So who want to start? Do you have any questions? You have a question.
I have a question. I have a question for David. Because I think I like very much the way you approach the question of the let's say COVID, or the challenges that the COVID pandemic has put on the table. But I want to ask, under this sort of great panic that has taken over the world with the COVID, isn't it true that there is a new agenda, a drastic change in the social contract that is also being surreptitiously actually implemented? And without debate and without questioning, that actually affects directly the Sustainable Development Goals. Because to give you just two examples, the imposition of digital systems of surveillance and social control are blurring completely the lines between democracies and autocracies. In the second, the imposition of a new digital economy is basically creating a tremendous inequality. I mean, not creating, exacerbating in an exponential way the inequalities that existed before, and the obsolescence of educational systems and of whole professions that, according to reports I have seen, between now and 2030, there will be full professions that will be completely replaced by artificial intelligence. So we are being told artificial intelligence is helping us or helping governments manage the pandemic. We are not being told that when we wake up, the world will be a completely different world. So what do you think about that?
I think well, it's a reflection more.
It's an easy question.
It's an easy,
it's an easy question. The answer is much more difficult.
No, the issue is no. Of course, I mean, I think thank you, Ambassador, no, for your comments and for your reflection on this issue. I absolutely agree on the point that I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting in all the aspects and segments of all societies, including the work. The inclusion of the artificial intelligence. Regarding to the issue, there have been no, global discussion, no? A global discussion about is affecting the social contract. In this sense, I think, of course, the social contract that we have all the societies, no, in Spain, in Turkey, in even we create an international social contract, no, in 1945. With the chapter of the United Nations, is the international, mechanisms to settle the conflicts. No discussions. Yeah, but the issue is the following. I mean, member states when they were so this panic on the pandemic, 2020, they used the emergency powers. But in accordance with, the ICCPR, the International Civil and Political Rights, there is an article and a provision on that. And then when there is a public, when it's affecting to the national security or it's affecting to the public health, and then states, they can use the executive powers, all of them. And then in this sense, it's very interesting, Camina, to go to the, there is a database, elaborated by the Oxford University about the different tracks, in which tracks were affecting, health, schools, but it was, but it was the first time, maybe, in at least in our generation, the first time happened this kind of shock. But but I think the issue of the artificial intelligence, this is something that is coming from the past, but now. I sometimes in Geneva we have this, the Davos Forum, the Davos, and then they are based, the World Economic Forum is based, and then sometimes they have invited the different ambassadors then to participate, to exchange, and they say, at least they say, that the trend and the process of artificial intelligence and you say, the digital economy, this is something that already started in the past, but now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's accelerating the process. We are going to a new, we need a new social contract, maybe.
Indeed. That is my point. It's a new social contract.
But we have to review our institutions, because the institutions are the ones who have to also evaluate. To absorb these changes. And so it is very important to support them and give you access to technologies, but also to review this solution.
But nobody that is not into the digital economy will have a future in the next 10 years. All the education in universities, in let's say 80%, is completely obsolete. This is something that has to be explained. And maybe people decide not to go in that direction. We are told we have to go because otherwise we die. Pandemic. So you have death, and this is the only road. What is false? I'm not saying that there was any illegal, let's say, rules or mechanism being imposed. No, that's not what I meant. Governments have certainly the right and the duty to protect their citizens, to apply any measures but that doesn't mean the rules of the social contract have to change. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
But when they tell you, it's because this is to prevent you from dying, well, I think there is a false argument that puts together. It's like a metaphor, you know. It's you put the moon and the well, but it's not the same thing. The moon is reflected in the well, but they are not the same thing.
Yeah, only one small point, if I can clarify the issue, the social contract. What is very interesting, I mean, it's at least in the history of Europe, the word, I mean, Europe was based on the war, a lot of wars. I'm talking about in the Middle Ages, no, without, I mean, referring to the First and Second World Wars. And then in the 18th century, there were a revolution in Europe, at least at the level of philosophy,
Yes.
to create, I mean, Rousseau, Diderot, D'Alembert, no, the social contract. And then we pass from a society of war to a more peaceful, we can say, social. I give you a state, I give you my liberty to you, but you have to protect me. You have to protect me. I mean, you have then to give me right to food, right to, I mean, housing. But what happened then now with the COVID-19 pandemic? That, I mean, there is a lack of access to, I mean, even education for many people, even right to housing and food.
But
And the social contract it's
yeah, but how you put that social contract in machine learning? I mean, we are talking here about having a great future behind our backs. What about machine learning? I mean, who is going to be able to compete in the current academic curriculum with machine learning? Just a question. One.
Well, maybe the machines will play a role very in a mechanical way. The thing is, when the level of intellectual way,
No, machine learning means
yeah, the
they're
machine
autonomous.
autonomous.
They are
Yes.
not mechanical instruments for us to apply our knowledge. They generate knowledge.
Yes.
And if you know, in 2016, there was a revolutionary event when AlphaGo, the program created by Google, beat the world champion of Go. Go is much more complex than chess.
Yes.
And never ever in Asia anybody believed that the machine could actually create intuitive and innovative systems of playing the game. And it has been done. So forget about anything we thought about artificial intelligence. Machines do learn on their own. Better, faster, and you cannot compete with them.
But does mean, do you want to tell us if then the human being will be replaced? Or
Yuval Noah Harari in his
Yes.
latest book, as you all know and probably you all read, I think puts it very clearly. There will be a whole new class of redundant workers.
Yes, that's true. And the university
Nobody's
has to
telling
be
us,
Yes, true.
but every single government on the planet, I haven't heard anybody doing it differently, says we have to go more digital. We have to put more technology. We have to become more dependent on artificial intelligence. I haven't heard anybody saying, and this has a cost, and this comes with a bill, in which 50% of you will be without a job in the next 20 years. There's something here, we all talk about the SDGs, but the SDGs are directly in contradiction with this process. So either we go for the SDGs or we go for the digital economy and for the digital surveillance and for private like how to say, facial recognition based systems of social control.
Yeah.
But there is a basic contradiction we have to address. If we are talking SDGs, we are talking about principles and values that will not have a place in the world that's coming.
So we have to continue, or have to create?
I don't know. We have to put the question on the table.
Someone
As I said,
wants to
I don't have the answers.
intervene with a question or appreciation of this point? Please.
Sorry. I think it's very interesting what you say, Mr. Ambassador, about Yuval Harari and the
Homo Deus.
Homo Deus and Homo Deus, and then it's 24 rules for the century, something like that. But I think it's very interesting that the government needs to adapt themselves to the new reality. For example, now we heard about Facebook. They're gonna create the metaverse, but they won't create it alone. They will do it, and they will need government. For example, we're not talking just artificial intelligence. We're talking about new reality now that we are living right now. For example, we can see now by Zoom everything, pandemic changed the panorama, and we need to adapt to that panorama ourselves and our government. For example, this is a really good question. What the people will do? They will have a job later, but maybe yes, but in another area that, for example, if we see now about food security, all the governments are working in agriculture because they see that globalization, because of a virus, stopped everything for many, many months. And many people suffer that consequence. So, for example, now we can think the future is here. It's not like in 100 years. For example, with the metaverse, what is going to happen with the universities? A teacher can give a lesson with you need to put your goggles, and then you can have 500 people in a lesson. So how we need to adapt ourselves? So I think it's really good to put on the table that question and start to talk about that now, because it's happening. And I don't know if you saw the video of Mark Zuckerberg. He said, "I need the help of the government because it's gonna be a big change." So I just want to add that to the.
Well, also,
Thank you.
Yuval Noah Harari says in the same book that the algorithm will basically be the end of democracy. So I think you have to take the whole narrative, because it is not true that we live in an inevitable result. We make choices. It seems we are being told now there's no choices. That is the question that is changing. So if you have no choices, then what is the use of you to vote? And if you don't need to vote, and you don't need to elect your government, because maybe artificial intelligence will design a better system for you, more effective. Your whole principles are put into question. And what I think has to be addressed, and it seems science has this infallibility reputation. You cannot question science. Science is good. It's good because it's good. It's the new myth. It's like, you cannot question that. Otherwise, you become a sort of strange human being that is antisocial and that has to be probably locked up in a dark room so it doesn't contaminate other people with negative thinking. But the reality is that you can make a choice now. You will not be able to make a choice in 10 years.
Yes, it's important because you mentioned in one of your articles that because for Costa Rica, multilateralism is very important. We're a small country, we have no army, we depend on these forces to protect our country. So you mentioned that in the case of Spain or European Union can play important role. What will be this contribution, let's say, from?
Well, I think the European Union remains probably now the last stronghold of a normative power. That means power that is being exerted by creating standards that, because of its size and its volume, basically convince other players, international players, to adapt to it. From China to Canada or Australia. So I think that is an extremely important building block in multilateralism. Multilateralism without rules or without norms cannot function. The many other big powers basically are coming back to might makes right. I mean, the US doesn't need to convince you, that that's a case we need to agree upon. They said, you don't do this, we put sanctions on you and we break down your economy. China can use their power and its economic weight to basically take all your economic system out of business. Countries that control natural resources can say, well, I'm going to sell my gas. Russia can say, well, Europe, you're going to have a 500% increase in the price of gas. And then that basically creates huge socioeconomic problems. So I think the European Union and Spain, I think, is committed to this sort of reinforced multilateralism. and our government has been one of the main supporters of this, both in the European Union framework as well as the international, that we need to strengthen that system. Yes. The question is that the European Union is being challenged from within and from outside. I mean, we have to just recall the famous sentence of the ambassador that Donald Trump sent to Germany, that later became deputy head of intelligence. So he was not obviously a lunatic, but an insider, who basically said openly on the record and in front of journalists, we got rid of the Soviet Union, now there's another union that has to go. That was his opening remark, to basically tell the Germans what was his real job. I mean, there is a huge increase in populism. Populism that's been financed and fueled by disinformation, digital, the use of digital tools, massive use of digital tools in Europe, to basically weaken and question the principles on which the European Union is being built. And not to speak of states in fragile situation in which destabilization operations are actually being used in a very routine matter of fact manner. So these days, a conflict is not anymore invading your territory. The conflict is basically destabilizing your economy, creating in social tensions, using drones to assassinate your politicians or your leaders, and using every sort of possible manipulation. And that is actually outside of international law. It's completely out of control, and anybody who has money can hire those experts, hackers or whatever. There are companies that do that, and basically do the job for you. So I think that is not an easy, I mean, of course, there's no easy answer for it. I remember when Mark Zuckerberg went to Congress, when he was called for a hearing to respond to basically the many questions about the business practice of Facebook. Because Facebook promotes hate speech, because it's good for business. It's part of the business model. People are hooked much longer in something that really makes you high on adrenaline than basically watching a UN Security Council debate. Okay? So Mark Zuckerberg had in his defensive line, is like, at the end of the day, you need me. Because if you put limits in my way of operation, then China is going to take over. And he had that in his notes. So a journalist took a picture from the back. And that is the argument these kind of leaders are saying. But these days, there's one thing that most people don't actually think about, is that the whole internet infrastructure is controlled by 4 people. There are 3 companies: Amazon, Alphabet, and Microsoft. Anybody they don't want them to be part of the internet ecosystem is out of business.
Interesting, Ambassador. We will try to find ways to face this. Maybe one comment from here or someone from the... Yes.
I think it's a very interesting discussion, and what Ambassador Amon said. I tend to agree that the social contract is changing. But whereas the social contract might change, I'm afraid that the social fiber is not changing, but is simply disappearing. And you see the last 1.5 years, just here in Turkey, my kids reached a rural home for 18 months, no school. 18 months. We have not been in the office here basically for 18 months. I mean, we are a small team, that is fine. But more and more people, also for economic reasons, companies are saying you can work from home, you don't have to come to the office, you're going to save a lot of money. But what will be the impact on the well-being of the people? I mean, not everybody can afford to work from home in this case. so I think the social fiber as well is very crucial in a society. And I think the whole concept of society, if I do say, will come true. And I would not say it's not possible, because that's what we said about the books of Jules Verne as well. And all the things he wrote, they all came true. You're under the sea, we went to the moon, all these things happened. So even if for some people it still looks like fiction, I mean, most probably this will become reality. If it's not in 10 years, it's going to be in 20 or 30 years perhaps. But the impact on the social fiber will hit even more people that are with special needs, older people, families, poor families, and a lot of these things became clear through the pandemic as well. In a lot of European countries where they shifted to online education, and for those who don't live in Europe, I mean, but there is a lot of poverty as well, but people are masters in hiding and covering their poverty. But when families were asked to attend, or the kids were asked to attend school online, that's when actually a lot of politicians realized for the first time that not all the families have 3 or 4 or 5 laptops, or 3 or 4 or 5 smartphones, and so they struggled much more than expected with online education, because apparently not everybody has those needs. And if that continues with the impact on the social fiber, I mean, a serious group of people will not just perhaps lose their work, because some professions will already disappear, but also the difference between the haves and the non-haves. I mean, the middle class is actually already disappearing in most countries. Whereas when I was born, the middle class was the biggest group. Now it's almost
Shrinking.
It's shrinking. Almost a few more years it will be gone. And that doesn't really sound promising also from a peace point of view. Anyway, first some reflection.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone?
I will pass you my piece on the rise of digital feudalism.
Anything else? Ambassador, please,
I have a
Ambassador.
question for the panel. We have been living in these days something we watched in Hollywood movies 20 years ago. We're in the middle of it. And suddenly we have become actors. So one specific question for you. Which one is going to be the new role of the United Nations in this new world?
You basically are assuming the United Nations is going to lose its role.
Well, I don't have any answer for that. I
It's
would
a
like to
simple
know your
question.
opinion. You are the expert. You are the expert. With the new social contract, now Rousseau is part of no history, prehistory. So would be another question after that. The new role of the new United Nations, and what's going to happen with conflict like ours?
Google will make one, don't worry.
Indeed.
David, I
Yes,
think it's for you.
In this sense, I think, first of all, if we look the history of the humanity and then thousands of years, on multilateralism we have lived only 100 years. 100 years is only 3 generations of people. Maybe the grandparents of us lived in the first experiment that was the League of Nations. And then we really believe on the multilateralism. It's based on the notion of cooperation. And people say, look, I mean, the United Nations is not working at all. United Nations is not, like, this is my viewpoint, no, the Security Council. United Nations is also the funds, the programs, the specialized agencies. We have many of them. And what I think it's important to underline that most of the decisions taken by the United Nations are taken by consensus. When people say that United Nations is not working, they disagree. No, it's not true. Most of the resolutions adopted in World Health Organization, even in the Human Rights Council, 70% of the resolutions of the Human Rights Council are adopted by consensus. International Labour Organization. This means that we have a forum then to agree in important issues. In technology, there are working groups on the issue on technology, artificial intelligence in UNESCO. And I think United Nations should do is to be adapted to the new 21st century. But it's very valuable, the work made, and to be of the UN, but not only the UN system. The United Nations, the multilateralism is not only the UN, it's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, also the Turkish Council, the GRULAC. I mean, the integration and cooperation. I think this is vital, and we need them to continue in that way. I don't know.
Thank you. Any other comments or other question? Yes, please.
Mr. Ambassador said that the traditional political tools that we have are not efficient enough today to deal with new security threats, to new conflicts. What about the bottom-up approach?
Sorry?
Bottom-up.
Bottom-up.
approach.
So,
I mean,
bottom-up.
Ah, bottom-up.
top-down,
Bottom-up.
bottom-up approach, because as Pinar said, individuals matter.
Hmm.
So, my question is for you too now. Do you think that a bottom-up approach can be used specifically within the SDG 60? How can we use it?
Pinar, maybe?
First, maybe Pinar, and then
Okay.
I will take over the microphone.
Thank you very much. Well, the thing is that in terms of the realization of SDG 16, we say we need peace, justice, and strong institutions. We first of all expect it to come from governments, to come from states. But in any case, in terms of the change of mentality, what we need is it to come from individuals. And when we talk about politicians, their agendas are different, their motives are different. So in that regard, I would say we would need a reform of education. Like, for instance, for human rights purposes, general areas are not my expertise, but if I try to approach the issue from more from my research interest, in terms of human rights education, one of the problems is that also we see at the UN level that some states argue that their human rights understanding is different, their culture requires something else, etc. But fundamental human rights, the right to live, this should not be optional. So that requires a more of a reformative approach, and we will have to inflict this on every individual since the very beginning of their educational lives. As we see in Turkey, if I connect this to our previous question, not to the whole machine learning, but in terms of the use of technology, internet, we have witnessed in Turkey with the Syrian refugees how information is being distributed in a purposeful manner. The UNDP's assistance is reflected in social platforms, for instance, as money that Turkish citizens are paying from their own pockets, and they are feeling animosity. This is an incredible issue because while there are many issues related to this, there are downsides, upsides, etc., but refugees being a part of a bargaining process, or they being put on the target as, they are living off of our back. This is not acceptable, but this is being felt, and this is also part of populism. This is something that is not only in Europe in terms of breaking the union, but in whole world. We see racism increasing, and this is being felt, this is being supported, and this is being supported by politicians because it turns to them as votes. This we have to change. How can we do that? As academics in our universities, when we are teaching, we can just talk about how important these are. We can educate our students in terms of being critical. I mean, this is a huge process. It's not something that can easily be done, etc. But this is why I say that we need a reformative approach. It's easier said than done, that's for sure. But we have to place tolerance at the basis, not this specific human right or that human right. But in terms of tolerance and tolerance for diversity and the richness that diversity brings to our lives, we have to learn to appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Pinar.
So, sorry?
Yeah.
Or to put the individual at
The center of the
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
their needs.
Listen, I think it's a very good question. I think I fully agree that precisely that is what I was coming to. Intergovernmental conferences, like in the past, like the Middle East Peace Conference, like the agreements to solve the Central American wars and dirty wars and the whole and the whole geopolitical confrontation are probably something of the past. Because the new actors in conflict mostly are non-state actors. I mean, in the last wars, if we look at the last wars in the Middle East, they have all been determined or defined by non-state actors. Be it Daesh or the Islamic State, be it the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, being the Houthis in Yemen, being Hezbollah in Lebanon, being the militias in Libya. Not a single regular army has been the defining factor. So there is no sense, there's no door you can go to make a deal. There's not a government that is going to sort out a situation in which the guys holding the guns on the ground are not an army. They're armed, but they're a group that responds to a different kind of leadership, different kind of principles. So yes, we need to bring in a much more bottom-up approach. The question is to define how that is going to work. It's extremely tricky and very difficult. Whom do you give agency, or who do you recognize as a legitimate representative?
Which track you will use to approach it?
Well, it's obviously that track 2 is the only option to get us out of that problem. And that is why track 2 diplomacy is becoming now the most widely used tool for conflict resolution. I mean, the recent agreement on Libya was signed not in the UN headquarters in Geneva, but on the Humanitarian Dialogue Center of Geneva, who had been actually creating the different track tools that eventually brought this to happen. Under the UN leadership and with UN involvement and obviously the legitimacy that the UN has for that. But it was a recognition that it was through the track 2 initiatives that had worked. And we all need to recognize that traditional diplomacy cannot work now in this void as before, because you need to create new alliances between the multilateral system, between bilateral states or governments, and between civil society, specialized organizations, NGOs, or whatever it is. So it's not that one can replace the other. We live now in a completely fluid and hybrid environment, multipolar, in which many different players have agency. So the question here is that the question of refugees, for me, is a key issue, because there's a weaponization of this element. And I think Turkey has been suffering that particularly, or more than others, because of the recent conflicts are finding its main outlet for refugees through Turkey. So the question is, when those refugees become migration flows that then move into the European space, that becomes a critical issue, a crisis. So that is another argument precisely for conflict resolution to be taken much more seriously. And until now, the problem is that the nexus between humanitarian action, stabilization, and development does not really pay attention to conflict resolution, to mediation, conflict prevention, and all those tools. It is sort of sidelined or considered a secondary element, while humanitarian action or stabilization are the result of badly managed conflict resolution. And development becomes absolutely impossible in a conflict environment. So we need to put conflict resolution and conflict prevention, I think, on top of the list. And I think, and I argued, I published an article recently on precisely how the SDGs could be effectively implemented as part of the international agenda. And I said, basically, my conclusion was that it's only through conflict resolution and conflict prevention. And let's not forget, because sometimes we are forgetting that the prevention of conflict or the resolution of conflict is the primary mission of the UN. It was created for that. Later on, it grew in many different ways
Agencies.
and agencies and to promote human rights and social development and economic cooperation and all sorts of things. But the original task is that if the UN fails in that, it will fail in its main goal, and it will be then questioned as a useful tool for this, or as a base
Yes.
for the multilateral system. So I think
So prevention,
conflict resolution. Prevention or
back
conflict
to the
resolution.
core of the task of the United Nations. Any other question? You want to intervene? It's okay. You want? Yes, please.
Yes, just a general comment, and it's something that very often appears, and I see my colleague from UNDP is here as well. Several questions were about what will the UN do, what can the UN do, but the UN is us. The UN are the member states.
State members.
It's not me, it's not Alvaro, it's not even Antonio Guterres. And that is what very often in this kind of discussions is forgotten. Because what Professor Ramon said as well, but I think there's not one country who will not participate in this digitalization, because the country who does not will work itself out of the market. And then the UN should solve it, but the UN is are these different countries. So we sometimes forget that the UN, it's not the, if the UN would be like an entity or a body we could people solve all these things in 5 minutes. We could put some smart people together. We have about 200 countries sitting there. They all have to agree. And so the problem is that very often the consensus goes to the lowest common denominator. And when we have real issues that we see, for example, on climate, what kind of consensus do we have? We bring it so low that everybody has to agree. So it's not the UN. The UN is us. The UN are the member states. So the questions we are asking should be, what can my government do? Not what can the UN do. And that happened. I mean, I'm not saying I don't feel offended because I work for UN. I work for many other organizations. And before I worked for the UN as well, I said, what can the UN do? No, I work for my government. What if first is what can my government do within the UN to try to find others to push it forward within the EU, within the Benelux, within the EU, within the UN, and so on. So it's just a general reflection that we often say UN will solve it, but that's not so easy as it.
No, but if I may, just a comment on
Yes.
that, it's a very important point. I mean, I think that technological governance is at the core of all these issues. And the question is that only the UN can actually take that forward. And certainly has to be the member states of the UN that will put that on the table. But those governments will do it if there is a real demand from their constituencies. I mean, I am a firm believer that you cannot turn your attention from new technologies and artificial intelligence. Obviously, any country who does not use them will be obsolete and completely lose the train.
A failed state.
But the question is that it needs to be done within a context of what they call now technological humanism, or sort of a social contract that does not take rampant inequality as the main principle. What I was arguing was not against technology. Technology is like the steam engine in the 19th century, or the metal or the metal tools in the first millennium. Is a reality. The question is what you use it for and how you actually integrate that into a system of global governance. We are losing perspective, and then we are basically blaming the UN for not being able to solve it. But it actually, I agree with Tim, it actually starts here. It starts as the local constituencies. So it's true, but it has to be a demand. It has to be put on the table. It has to be discussed. The question is that if you consider that this is your only access to information, and that you don't need to really question anything, because whatever comes through this is never going to question your need for this. That would be a completely absurd expectation, even if we think that Larry Page or Sergey Brin are philanthropists, but you need to demand that they conform the same way capitalists had to create social, a social security system to make the system work. Of course, in pure capitalism of the 19th century, it was each one on its own, and those who do not make it, let them die. The question is that then the system created a certain social contract in which the interests of all the parties basically could be accommodated. And that is the result of the welfare state in the second half, after Second World War. So if there are possibilities, of course there are possibilities. Marx considered in the 19th century it was impossible. He said capitalism will self-destroy because of the selfishness, and it will grow into contradictions it cannot resolve. And then social democracy came in, and it was evidently possible. So technology can also be accommodated into a social contract, but not in the terms that are being presented or that are not being presented. It's like these contracts in which, everybody, every one of us, when you have to agree on the terms of use of any application you get, you all scroll straight back because you have 10 pages of very small print that nobody understands. So you basically go down, you agree, and you go on with your life. But in that small print, you actually sold your soul. You basically accepted that all your belongings are going to go to whatever is offering you the application, and you basically marry the mother-in-law of the designer of the application.
Well, happily, we are returning. So the main point we had from the beginning is, from my point of view, how to have stronger institutions, because at the end, we have to work from there as a state and the core of the individual in the center, but also the state as an actor, how to contribute in the society. Do we have another intervention? No?
I actually wanted to add something to what Tom has said. Actually, one of the things that we see in terms of practice, I'm teaching international law to second year students at university, and every year I ask them if international law is functioning efficiently at the beginning of the semester. I repeat this question at the end of the semester, and when we continue in the second semester, I repeat my questions at the end and at the beginning and the end. They have a change of faith at the end. They start very negatively in general, but the same thing applies to the UN. When we are talking about the United Nations, we always put the blame, but we are not talking about a supranational institution. It's an intergovernmental organization, and it's the government that enabled and disabled the United Nations. So it was quite striking for me when I was researching for my first book on R2P. I was looking at country statements, and Sudan at that time, it was the height of the genocide claims. And the Sudanese representative said for the 2009 report of the Secretary General, his remark was that trusting R2P with the Security Council is like trusting a wolf with a sheep. This was coming from Sudan, practically. And the problem is that when we look at the Security Council with the veto power and the unwillingness of states and acting on their self-interested motives all the time, it's not possible for the UN to deliver the documents. The Right to Peace Declaration is there. The World Summit Outcome document is there. There are many things from refugees to IDPs to responsibility to protect. But the action is not coming from the governments because they are either blocking the decisions or ignoring certain things. So in that regard, it is the governments that they have to take upon their promises in general terms. Besides individuals, as individuals, we have a different role. This is when Menant has said from bottom up, this is an impact that we can make. Civil society civil society organizations. That may be part of the change, but the governments have to change. They have to live up to their promises.
But now that is, I think, a very important point. But it's in contradiction with what you said before about, you said social media will make individuals much more influential on global affairs. I think it's exactly the opposite. Social media are basically creating a completely uncontrollable system in which nobody knows who is behind what, and in which basically you can be manipulated in a way that is much worse than anything that existed before. I don't think social media are giving us any real tool. I agree that we have to work through institutions, we have to work through our governments, we have to work through real representation. Social media is a fake representation, it's a virtual representation. And as such, it can be used in ways that we cannot even imagine. I mean, even when the US, that is the most advanced country in the world, basically has to run an investigation on how, through social media, the elections of 2016 were manipulated, it shows you that social media is not a tool that guarantees that, individual agency is going to be restored. And if you look at the use of social media and the decline in the faith of democracy, there are statistics, and it proves that it goes absolutely in opposite directions. From 2010 until 2020, the growth of social media obviously is an exponential line up. The decline in the trust of democracy and political leaders goes exactly in the opposite direction. So there is a clear connection between both. Because the weaker the governments, the more powerful individual interests become. The less regulation, the less control, the more you can actually manipulate public opinion and decision making. So I think we have to be very careful with the role we give social media.
On my part, I'm not in favor of giving a specific role of social media. I just, in terms of an enabler, I mentioned social media. So it's like vaccine. You may use it for good purposes or bad purposes. So it depends on the use. It's a tool. It's a way of communication, not the medium in general terms. So
No, but I think there is something very, very important that we need to be aware of. The real resource of the 21st century is data. Social media is a tool to basically take data from the citizen for free in exchange of gadgets. This thing they said that when they bought Manhattan, when the Dutch went to and bought Manhattan, they bought Manhattan for a few trinkets. I mean, we are being offered trinkets in exchange of our data. And our data is the real economic resource of our time. So there has to be, I think, a certain clarity on how social media are actually changing our life. I don't think they're really making us any big service.
Thank you.
I
Please.
yeah.
But isn't it the governments most of the time control the social media this way or that way? So it comes to the power again. Whatever we see, fake or real.
I don't think governments control social media. I think there is enough evidence actually to basically defend the opposite. I think when you look at facial recognitions, I mean, when Mark Zuckerberg said, "Oh, we need the help of governments," it's actually the governments that need the help of Mark Zuckerberg, because Facebook is the most important facial recognition system in the world, and they actually sell it to governments. At one point, they will not need governments to basically buy it from them. They could just do it themselves. And so there's plenty of examples on how conflicts are being promoted through social media to destabilize governments. Of course, social media becomes a tool in power struggle. So there are governments that use social media against other governments, or parties that use social media against other parties. But you know, it's the same thing when you can hire assassins and send them to kill somebody. But I don't think governments do control social media.
Thank you.
They can try censorship, but I think it's quite unsuccessful overall.
You want to repeat?
Una cosa muy rápida. Sí. A very quick issue. Now we are discussing about social media, but I mean, we need to distinguish between which kind of society we want to live on in the 21st century, and a society of knowledge or a society of information. Because now we are discussing now here it's about information. We are bombarded by thousands of Twitters, by thousands of social networks, but we need to work for a society of knowledge, and for that what we need it's not only an education, and a quality education, and this is something that is advocating. I mean, UNESCO and the different institutions dealing with education quality and education. And for the future, I think we need to take advantage of the new technologies and to have maybe a hybrid education, and to use the add value also of the new technologies, because maybe sometimes you have a professor from Harvard or from Bangladesh or from from a good professors on health on Cuba, and then and people from Europe can get access to this to this professor thanks to the new technologies, no? And then we need to balance, and then to use the good practices on the issue on the hybrid education, no, and the technologies. So this is,
I just have a question on that, because I think theoretically is very nice what you are saying.
yeah.
But do